At 20 years old, Hannah Brooks watched a locksmith change the locks on the house she thought was hers. She stood on the sidewalk with one suitcase, a backpack, and nowhere to go. Her ex-boyfriend, Derek Lawson, didn't even look embarrassed. He simply folded his arms. The court already signed the papers. Hannah stared at him. "You forged my signature. I have no idea what you're talking about." She knew exactly what had happened. After her parents died 3 years earlier, Hannah inherited the small suburban house they had spent 20 years paying off. She trusted Derek. He convinced her to let him help with the paperwork. He handled the bills, the refinancing, the insurance, everything. She believed him, until she learned he had quietly transferred ownership into a company he secretly controlled. By the time she discovered the fraud, the legal documents appeared legitimate. Without enough money to hire an attorney, she lost everything. Now the house belonged to Derek, and she belonged nowhere. That night she slept inside her aging hatchback. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. She stared at the ceiling. Her grandmother's voice echoed inside her memory. "If life ever corners you, drive to the cabin." The cabin. She hadn't thought about it in years. As a child, every summer meant weekends in a tiny log cabin hidden deep within Pine Hollow Forest. After Grandma Eleanor died, nobody ever mentioned it again. Maybe it had been sold. Maybe it had collapsed. Maybe it was still there. The next morning, Hannah searched through the last box she still owned. Old photographs, birthday cards, family recipes. At the very bottom sat a small wooden jewelry box. Inside rested a brass key. Beneath it lay a folded note written in Eleanor's careful handwriting. "If you're holding this key, then someone has taken away the place you called home." Hannah's breath caught. The note continued. "Don't argue. Don't beg. Drive to the cabin." Tears filled her eyes. It was as though her grandmother had somehow known. The next sentence puzzled her. "Everything you need is already waiting there." 3 hours later, Hannah left the city. The highway gave way to winding mountain roads. Eventually pavement became gravel. Then gravel became dirt. Towering pine trees surrounded the narrow trail. Finally, she saw it. The cabin looked exactly as she remembered. Weathered cedar locks, stone chimney, wide wooden porch, a peaceful stream flowing beside it. Unlike her memories, however, the cabin seemed almost untouched by time. The brass key fit perfectly. The front door opened with a familiar creak. Dust floated through warm afternoon sunlight. Inside, everything remained. Grandma's rocking chair, the old cast-iron stove, bookshelves filled with worn novels. Even the faded quilt Hannah remembered from childhood. She smiled through tears. For the first time since losing her house, she felt safe. The following days became strangely peaceful. She cleaned every room, patched broken shutters, repaired loose floorboards, started a vegetable garden. The cabin slowly came alive again. Then something odd happened. A black SUV stopped outside. A sharply dressed man stepped onto the porch. "My name is Victor Grant." He smiled politely. "I represent a private investment group." Hannah frowned. "This property isn't for sale. We're prepared to offer $600,000. She laughed. "For this cabin? Cash?" "No." His smile barely changed. "If you reconsider." He handed her a business card. "Call me." After he left, Hannah stood on the porch watching the SUV disappear. Something wasn't right. 3 days later, another visitor arrived. Different company, different representative. This offer exceeded $1 million. Again, she refused. Now she knew. Nobody offered that kind of money for an old mountain cabin. There had to be another reason. That evening, she reread her grandmother's note. This time, she noticed faint writing near the bottom, almost invisible. She held the paper beneath a lamp. New words slowly appeared. "Start with the writing desk." Her pulse quickened. Grandma's old writing desk still stood beside the living room window. She searched every drawer. Nothing. Then she discovered one drawer was shallower than the others. A false bottom. Carefully she lifted it. Inside rested another envelope, along with an old brass compass. The envelope contained a single sentence. "Trust the fireplace." Hannah looked toward the massive stone fireplace dominating the room. At first it appeared ordinary. Then she noticed one stone slightly darker than the others. She pressed it. A soft click echoed through the cabin. The fireplace shifted backward several inches. Hidden behind it stood a narrow iron door. No way. The brass compass fit perfectly into a circular slot beside the lock. The mechanism turned. The door slowly opened. Cold air drifted outward. A stone staircase descended into darkness. Far below the cabin, Hannah grabbed a flashlight, then carefully walked down. The staircase spiraled nearly 3 stories underground. Finally, it opened into an enormous hidden chamber. She froze. Concrete walls, steel shelving, water filtration systems, generators, rows of filing cabinets stretching into darkness. It looked less like a basement, and more like a secure underground archive. At the center stood a handcrafted oak table. A single envelope rested there. Across the front were 3 words. For Hannah only. Hands trembling, she opened it. The first sentence made her blood run cold. If you've reached this room, then the people searching for these records have probably found the cabin too. Searching? What records? Before she could continue, a distant engine echoed through the chamber. Then another. Then another. She rushed toward a security monitor mounted on the wall. Miraculously, it flickered to life. Outside the cabin, 3 black SUVs had just entered the clearing. 6 men climbed out, and one of them was Derek. Hannah's heart pounded. Derek stepped out of the lead SUV. 5 men followed him. None looked like lawyers. None looked like police. They carried surveying equipment, document cases, and radios. They weren't there for the cabin. They were there for whatever her grandmother had hidden. Hannah turned back to Eleanor's letter. Her hands trembled as she continued reading. If Derek is among them, then he finally learned what your parents spent years protecting. She froze. Her parents? The next sentence stunned her. They never told you because they wanted you to have a normal childhood. She kept reading. 30 years earlier, Eleanor Brooks had worked as the chief accountant for a large land development company. While reviewing financial records, she uncovered an enormous fraud. Executives were secretly stealing mountain properties by forging deeds, creating fake corporations, and intimidating elderly landowners into selling for almost nothing. When Eleanor discovered the scheme, she copied every document before resigning. Your grandfather, your parents, and I spent years quietly buying key properties before the developers could. Not because the cabins were valuable, because the land beneath them controlled the region's largest protected freshwater reserve. Rather than expose everything immediately, they created the Brooks Conservation Trust. Every original deed, every financial record, every confession, every forged contract, everything was hidden beneath the cabin, waiting for the one person they believed would protect it, waiting for Hannah. A valuation report slipped from the folder. Current trust value, $231 million. She stared silently. $231 million. Not because of the cabin, because the trust controlled thousands of protected acres surrounding the mountain watershed. Above her came a loud crash. The cabin door. They were inside. She continued reading. The trust transfers only to the heir who refuses to surrender the cabin. Without realizing it, she already had. Then she noticed another envelope. Smaller. Addressed simply. My sweet Hannah. She opened it carefully. If you're reading this, then someone has already hurt you. Tears formed instantly. I prayed that day would never come. She continued. Your parents knew Derek years before you met him. Hannah's eyes widened. That couldn't be possible. The letter explained. Derek's father had worked for one of the fraudulent development companies Eleanor exposed. After the investigation quietly stalled decades earlier, several families connected to the scheme continued searching for the missing records. When Derek entered Hannah's life, it wasn't an accident. At first, he genuinely fell in love with her. But after learning who her grandmother was, his family pressured him to discover where the documents had been hidden. When he couldn't find them, they convinced him to steal Hannah's house, believing she would eventually return to the cabin. Exactly as she had. Hannah felt sick. The relationship she believed was real had slowly become something else. The final pages contained one last message. None of this is your fault. Trust yourself. Leave through the spring tunnel. A detailed map showed a hidden passage behind the underground water filtration system. Above her, footsteps echoed down the staircase. Someone shouted, "Search every room. The archive has been opened." Hannah quickly packed the deeds, trust agreements, journals, and evidence into a waterproof document case. She hurried toward the filtration room. Behind several water tanks, she found a concealed bronze wheel. She turned it. A section of the stone wall slowly slid aside. Cold air rushed through the opening. Behind her, another voice shouted, "She's still here." Without hesitating, Hannah entered the tunnel. The hidden passage followed a crystal-clear underground stream beneath the mountain. Nearly 30 minutes later, daylight appeared ahead. She emerged beside a natural spring hidden within a narrow valley. A small ranger cabin overlooked the water. Inside waited a wooden desk, a satellite phone, fresh batteries, and one final envelope. Her grandmother had anticipated every possibility. Inside rested attorney Rebecca Sloan's business card. A handwritten note read, "Call before anyone else." Hannah dialed immediately. The attorney answered before the second ring. "Hannah Brooks." She blinked. "You were expecting me?" "For almost 20 years." Rebecca explained everything. Eleanor had created the Brooks Conservation Trust decades earlier. The trust automatically transferred ownership once Hannah recovered the original records. The moment that happened, legal protections activated. State investigators, environmental agencies, federal financial crime units. Everyone received notification. The people searching the cabin weren't conservation investors. They represented shell corporations connected to decades of land fraud. The evidence Eleanor preserved documented forged deeds, bribery, money laundering, and illegal property transfers involving hundreds of millions of dollars. Even Derek's role became clear. Although he had participated in the property fraud by transferring Hannah's home into a shell company, investigators determined he had also been manipulated for years by older members of the organization. His testimony, combined with the records from the cabin, dismantled the remaining network. Dozens of fraudulent property transfers were reversed. Several executives received prison sentences. The homes of elderly families were returned to their rightful owners. Months later, Hannah officially became director of the Brooks Conservation Trust. Reporters expected her to sell the mountain properties immediately. Instead, she refused. She permanently protected the watershed. The cabin became the trust's headquarters. Revenue from carefully managed conservation agreements funded legal aid for victims of property fraud, housing assistance for homeless young adults, and scholarships for students studying environmental law and land conservation. Exactly the causes her grandmother had always believed in. 1 year later, the old cabin looked alive again. Fresh cedar logs glowed in the afternoon sun. The gardens flourished. The stream sparkled beside the porch. Families hiked protected trails throughout the valley. Children learned about conservation at the education center Hannah established nearby. One quiet evening, she sat in Eleanor's rocking chair beside the fireplace. The same fireplace that had hidden the truth for decades. She smiled. Everyone believed she escaped to a forgotten cabin after losing her home. Some believed she became wealthy because of luck. Neither was true. Her grandmother hadn't left her a fortune. She left her proof. Proof that truth could survive decades. Proof that greed never wins forever. And proof that even after losing everything, one hidden door can lead to an entirely new life. For the young woman who arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart, that became the greatest inheritance of all.